chapter 1156, and I had a few predictions from last chapter looking forward to this one on where the flashback would lead us to next, with the last chapter ending with the Rocks pirates putting their plan of taking over Hachinosu into action. So the big predictions I did have from a couple weeks ago were completely wrong. Even the stuff I could say I was right about, I was still wrong about. Quickly on the anime, episode 1137, I don't know what I was expecting, but it blew those non-existent expectations out of the water. Another ridiculously good episode. The adaptation of Kuma's backstory and this episode altogether, I couldn't have hoped for anything better than this, and we'll carry that sentiment over to the manga because what more can you ask of the story when this is what we are being given? There's no cover story again, so for the second week running there is a colour spread, this time of the monster trio of the respective Pirate King crews, Luffy carrying the mini straw hats except for Nami, who's regular sized for whatever reason, Roger, Rayleigh, Goban, Luffy, Zoro, Sanji and Nami. I guess it could be because she was there with Luffy and Zoro when they met Goban for the first time, so that would make sense. That's actually a really cool detail, I think, if that was the intention behind her inclusion here. Although leave it to Oda to move away from the cover story for 2 chapters in a row right when we get to the interesting stuff. I am still saying that's Shiki's grave, by the way. I know Ryuma is the obvious answer, especially since the shrine is in ruins and we know Gekko Moria desecrated Ryuma's shrine to get his hands on Enma, the born in the West Blue part. It makes things trickier, but there's no reason Ryuma couldn't have been born in the West Blue if he was still raised in Wano. But to think outside the box, I'm saying that is Shiki's, and here's to hoping we get the answer to this question next chapter. And this one opens not on Elbaf nor with the Rocks pirates, but instead another pirate crew that has gone very under the radar in recent times, but has also caught our attention on multiple occasions as well, with small details about them being dropped here and there in the story or SBS. We see the Kuja pirates of 3 generations ago, who at the time were led by Empress Gloriosa, future Granny Nyon, and of course, given her position, she was seen as the pinnacle of beauty, grace, elegance, and so on. There's no date or year attached here, but assuming it is chronological, it would be somewhere within the 6 years between 44 years ago when Rocks took over the pirate island and the God Valley incident 38 years ago where we know she was present. But since there is no date, let's say that this is still 44 years ago. And also making an appearance here is Tritoma, the future Empress of Amazon Lily, who held the position before Boa Hancock. She was introduced to us in the SBS of volume 109 when somebody asked a question about the love sickness, where he drew her for the first time, and as is now tradition with any new female character dead or alive of suitable age, well, not even, because even Bello Betty went through this and she's only 34 years old. Tritoma had to go through the rotation of theories discussing whether or not she is Luffy's mother. The timeline kind of works given Dragon's age, which at this point in time 44 years ago would be 11 years old, and he's 55 in the present, and I would say Tritoma here would be about 14, 15 here maybe. It's hard estimating ages in this story when you have babies that look like this, but with those ages it does sound feasible. But if she is in fact Luffy's mother, that means that she would have left Amazon Lily to be with Dragon and she would have started a family with him. So if that was the case, then surely she would have been able to overcome the sickness by being with him, unless there is more to this story, which there most definitely would be. So for the time being, while I like it, I will hold off from saying that she is Luffy's mother for now. But yeah, Tritoma's first appearance outside of that SBS, congratulations to her, although this isn't going to be the last time SBS 109 is going to be brought up in this video. We are also not done with the introductions just yet, because while I did say Gloriosa as the Empress of the time was the pinnacle of beauty, grace, strength and much more, that was a lie, because she would be upstaged by her first mate, the Empress after her, Shaku Yaku, more commonly known to us as Shaki, Rayleigh's wife, who we only found out about being a former Empress during the intermission chapters between Wano and Egghead. And she has that way of carrying herself just like in the present, where she is very comfortable in her own skin. She doesn't need to try and impress anyone, she doesn't need to overdo it. The narrator box says it perfectly. She was and still is a seductress, one who was sought after by one of the biggest names on the seas, Gold D. Roger himself, who he himself was sought after by the overshadowed Empress Gloriosa, making for a very special kind of love triangle, kind of awkward as well, since we know it was Rayleigh, Roger's right-hand man, and the only man who had enough self-respect not to be bewitched by Shaku Shaki's charms like Roger and Gabon were, it was Rayleigh who eventually got together with her after the Roger pirates disbanded and after Roger's death. I mean, we do know Roger moved on from this very superficial love, so seeing him fawn over Shaki here does make me want to see how he met Rouge, because although it isn't clear, I would like to think he and Rouge were a thing long before he decided he wanted to have a kid. Someone who could take his eyes away from the infamous Kuja. After he met her, he only had eyes for her. Add that to the long list of stories that could be told in some One Piece anthology series, and enter the ever-present third party, the Navy, and while everyone is preparing to sail off, Roger learns that Garp is at the helm. So he switches up instantly. He wants the smoke. Remember back in chapter 1096 where we saw Garp was only gung-ho about going after Roger, and that was pretty much the sole reason for his presence on God Valley? This makes crystal clear that he wasn't the only one who felt that way, because Roger is showcasing that exact same mentality here. This was never a case of cat and mouse back then, as some people thought it was, where Garp had a one-sided obsession with Roger, so was continuously chasing him. This went both ways. This was cat, and these weren't just any cats, these were lions. So as we've heard before about their rivalry and Garp cornering Roger multiple times, that was no exaggeration. Both, and I repeat because I don't care about any agendas here, both Roger and Garp had the capabilities of taking the other one out. And this was before Garp was even given the title of hero on God Valley, so it's not like he wasn't already making a name for himself beforehand. He really was after Roger from day one. Bringing in the narrator again, Roger, Garp, and Rox, those three named specifically, some people really do need to be spoon-fed word for word what the story has been trying to tell them for so long. Back to Gloriosa though, we see her nearly passing out, and this is of course her falling victim to the love sickness and revisiting the Amazon Lily arc chapter 523, where she explains to Boa Hancock, who is now in love with Luffy, how suppressing those emotions ruined the former empresses. First, Tritoma, the empress before Hancock, we know she died from the love sickness. Before her was Shaki, who assumedly was struck by it after falling for Rayleigh but managed to survive by leaving her post and marrying him. And before her was Gloriosa, and back to SBS 109, another question was asked about who it was she was in love with and if it was a member of the Rocks Pirates. We now know she survived by leaving her post to chase after Roger as a member of the Rocks Pirates, and I guess she eventually found some kind of closure in the fact that she wouldn't be able to reach him. Meanwhile, as the world is picking up steam, we are back in Elbaf for a bit, where Loki has been trying to make his way out to sea, to be free like rocks, to no avail though, and to the disdain of some other giants, with Harald finally learning about how the rest of the country feels towards Loki. Not including Ida though, because she is acting as 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times the mother that Estrid ever was by standing up for him, even more than Harald mind you, but given his position as the king, I suppose he does need to try to push aside the fact Loki is his son and look objectively at the problems Loki has caused. But Ida has no such responsibilities, so she can speak as freely as she wishes. Plus, this is taking place in her bar that she built, so she has no reason to filter her thoughts. I was already very much in the camp that I want Mosa's true identity to be Ida for this exact reason, to give Loki a motherly figure, and while Loki and Hyrudin are at odds here in the flashback and even more so in the present, Ida's presence I think would be huge for both their stories. We see Mato as well, the present bartender, who seems to have already started working at the bar here 44 years ago, which is cool, and it seems Ida was a caring and calming presence for pretty much any kid on the island really. We see everyone loved her. The only times I can think where there were problems perhaps were first with the elders, who didn't allow her and Harald's marriage, but even then the rest of the country accepted her straight away pretty much. And the other time was during the famine, where there was an altercation with another giant, although even then that giant was going after Hyrudin specifically and she only stepped in to protect him. So with all of that, with how well she has settled into the country, where would she be in the present if she is still alive? Did Harald's death cause some complications for her maybe? She had the king's protection, so afterwards some purists came out of the woodworks once the king was now out of the picture, forcing her away possibly. Saul is still here though, and he is not an elbaf giant, so I don't know. We are told about Rox inviting Harald and Loki trying to invite himself, with his tantrum continuing in the background, one that is partly justified to be fair given and how he's been treated, and we move some months ahead, presumably the same year, so still 44 years ago, on Hachinosu now, where a mysterious figure is walking through the island looking to join the Rocks pirates, to the amusement of everyone else, because come on, it's the Rocks pirates. They would eat 99.9% of people alive, but this is no ordinary person. This is the mobster Kyo, later known as Silver Axe, and based purely on appearance alone, before reading the text, I thought this was the first canonical appearance of the former Navy Admiral Zephyr from film Z. There is some clear resemblance, especially Zephyr from his Navy days, the hair, so if Kyo here, not yet Silver Axe, ends up having deep purple hair, we will need to have a talk. But there's more, because before being unveiled, he seems like a regular sized man, but as he grabs this random pirate, he looks 3 times that height, and what was first a full body cloak is now only big enough to be a cape, so he definitely grew in size here after being kicked, which is important because this could be a connection to Urouge, whose ability allows him to grow in size and strength after receiving damage. So could this be finally the time for the last supernova to receive some spotlight? Is this where his story begins with this man, Silver Axe, 44 years ago? And his outfit, he is also wearing a kimono, which is fitting given that he is stated to be Shiki's rival, so he is definitely a big time pirate. Also a mobster or yakuza just like Shiki as well. You wonder how far back their story goes, although in all honesty, as bombastic as it sounds, I feel like it is something that would be told to us via an SBS question, since there would be no time or space for it in the manga and nowhere for it to be slotted in. And lastly, his tattoo, which isn't exactly the same as Loki's, but I do see some similarities. Like, do those tattoos have larger significance? We see Loki had his tattoo before he left the country 14 years ago, which minimizes the possibility of the tattoos having any connection, so it may be nothing, but it also may be something. How deep does the tattoo lore go? It's also really interesting to me how before rocks blew the holes into the rock, it was viewed as a fish. It's a very throwaway detail, but at the same time, without the eyes, it does look like a fish, doesn't it? And the way it looms over the island, Rocks was also the biggest fish in the sea at the time as well, wasn't he? And he speaks of 2 fruits he wants, one which he believes is on Elbaf that only Harald would be able to use to its fullest potential. Genuinely, it might be fair to put Harald on that upper echelon tier alongside Rocks, Roger, Garp, Whitebeard and so on. Every word Rocks speaks of him only helps his case even more, and that is also definitely the fruit which Loki ended up eating 14 years ago. I should say here that I appreciate the fact as well that even though we are focusing on Rocks for the time being, Elbaf is still relevant to his plans, because at the end of the day, this is still a flashback on Elbaf's past. It helps the shift in focus feel more fluid, since the country is still important here, you know, in my opinion. The other fruit, however, I don't know what it could be, but what I think is that this mystery fruit will end up being the third and final devil fruit that Blackbeard ends up eating. That will be Blackbeard's final buff before the final war. And this man was also looking to bring the legendary shipwrights Galela. I'm trying my best to pronounce it differently from Galela, because right now they are 2 separate entities, even though we all think that they are very closely connected. Anyway, this is another link to Elbaf. Like what I was saying before, we aren't just seeing the Rocks pirates for the sake of seeing them. Be it Loki's obsession with Rocks, Rocks' obsession with Harald, the giant shipwrights. His story is very closely intertwined with Elbaf. This is more than just seeing legendary characters for the sake of seeing legendary characters. So here's a question. We know Rocks wasn't able to utilize at least one of those 2 devil fruits, since we know Harald did not eat it, but instead it was Loki 30 years after this point in time and 24 years after God Valley. Do you think Rocks' plan would have succeeded if he was able to win Harald over to his side? Harald, who would have hypothetically eaten this fruit. If he was able to do that, would Rocks be king of the world right now? I think so. I think Harald was that strong and that important, where his presence on God Valley would have completely tipped the scales. And back to the giant shipwrights, Galela, I'm doubling down on the theory that they were capable of building, and maybe even did way back in the day, build an ancient weapon, Pluton, which is now under Wano, which is why Rocks was after them, with Harald being the key to controlling them. So Harald really was the linchpin, or at least one of the linchpins for Rocks' grand plans. So that's another piece of the puzzle he was missing, Harald and an ancient weapon, courtesy of the shipwrights. credits. If he had those two things, he definitely would have gotten his way on God Valley, although Emu and the rest of the world government is another story. Plus, notice how Luffy in the final war will have those two pieces. He will have Loki, supposedly, who's eaten that devil fruit, and he will have at least one ancient weapon in Shirahoshi, Poseidon, and maybe two with Pluton, although I think Pluton will fall into the hands of Blackbeard. So one ancient weapon for each side, one for Luffy, one for Blackbeard, one for Emu. We see Captain John, Charlotte, Lin, and Struyson, who would have joined, I would say, within those 4 years between Rocks visiting Elbaf for the first time and taking over Pirate Island, as well as a fishman called Barbell, who would be this guy we saw in chapter 1096, towering over even Lin. So about the size of a small giant. And he seems to have gotten rid of the beads and the fiery hair by the time God Valley rolls around, if that's anything to keep in the back of your mind. And Kaido, who is the only one we can definitively say joined in the past few months after Rocks took over the island, and he very much is the runt of the litter here, clearly the apprentice we've been told that he was. That being said, I do think Rocks would have had big problems if any of the others spoke ill of Harald as well, but since we do know Rocks went back to Elbaf multiple times to try and convince him to join, it's safe to say that the other members would have all met him by this point in time, so they would be able to understand Rocks' ridiculously high praise for him, at least a little bit, all except for Kaido, who joined very recently, which would make him the only one who would speak of Harald that way, having never met him, so not knowing his strength but having met Rocks and knowing his strength. Really though, I did say Rocks had an obsession with Harald before, but it's really funny just how often he mentions him and how protective he is of him. And the final page, a spread of the near completed Rocks pirates. Elbaf is the key to taking down the Holy Land, and you know that holds true even in the present, which is why they approached Loki and tried to bring the country under their flag. Elbaf is just as important as it has been built up to be, and that makes me very happy. The fateful day of his mission that must have been God Valley, at least that's the easy answer, because we still need to see that whole thing to do with the world government stealing the treasure or jewel of the pirate island. Maybe that set his plans into motion much earlier than he would have liked, since he was missing some pieces, which is why they inevitably fell apart. But he was adamant that he would show them the peak of the world, which, if our current available information is anything to go by, he was not completely able to do. But it might be time, exactly 200 chapters after we first learned about it. It seems as if it's finally time to see the whole picture of what went down during that day. 38 years ago, not 14 years ago. There's a lot of days we need to catch up with. Every character present, every character interaction, every attack thrown, the fates of certain characters. Of course, Rocks is at the top of that list. Happened to him what happened to the island. They both disappeared and were erased from history, but what is the truth? While I do think Rocks is dead, how did Blackbeard inherit his father's will? Will we see Blackbeard's birth, which is 4 years from this point, 44 years ago, so 2 years before God Valley? Maybe there still is more to be covered before we see it. There's still many chapters to go for the rest of this backstory, so I think we can spare one or a few to see everything that was erased from history at the God Valley incident.